Hi there, so I'll be doing the presentation for Module 1, which is also Chapter 1 from the Ellis textbook, The Study of Second Language Acquisition. And so this will be really the only PowerPoint where I'm directly teaching information from one of our texts. And for the rest of the modules, we'll have different discussion leaders who are students from the group. You get assigned one chapter, 1 week, and you'll be the presenter for that week. I'm doing Module 1 first of all because it's the first week, and secondly because it's sort of a dry, dense chapter. I do not expect you guys to outline the entire chapter when you do your presentations. You can absolutely choose some of the most interesting or what you find to be most important subjects in that chapter and then highlight them using examples, using videos, using activities, and making it a little bit more interactive. So mine's going to be kind of dry because I'm trying to make sure that you really understand the information from this first chapter, and since it's sort of dense to read by yourselves, I'm hoping that at least between your reading of it and my presentation of it, you can walk away with a lot of the important understandings and a base of knowledge that'll help you understand and continue working through the rest of the course. So just to get started, if you've seen in the first chapter of the book, Ellis talks about a distinction that he makes between the terms SLA and second language acquisition. Even though SLA is technically the acronym for second language acquisition, he talks about using them as two separate terms. So when he refers to SLA, the acronym, as a term, he's talking to this entire field of study which has research and theories to support it. When he talks about second language acquisition, he's using this as synonymous to L2 acquisition, which is the object of study. So just as it's difficult to define terms in bilingual education such as bilingualism, what is a bilingual student, who qualifies as being bilingual, etc. You'll see that in this text too, there's sometimes interchanging of terms or authors who use terms differently or define them differently as well. So the more we learn kind of about second language acquisition and bilingualism, the harder it really is to define these terms because they're so dynamic. So you'll even see in policy that term names are often changing, as I'm sure you've seen with ESL. So we had, English as a second language, English as a new language, limited English proficient students, English language learners. So the terms are kind of ever evolving and changing because they do have slightly different connotations, and honestly, they're used differently across the US. And sometimes even within a school, people will use terms differently. All right, so let's get started. I will also have this PowerPoint available for you to just use as a reference and download. All right, so what is second language acquisition? It typically refers to any new language that's learned after the native or first language. So this can sometimes still be tricky to define because sometimes people learn languages simultaneously. They might have a bilingual family. Okay, so there's also a difference between second language and a foreign language. And if you see the description in the text, it talks about how an L2 or a second language is a language that's being taught in the classroom, but it's also used in the community. So for example, English is considered a second language in the United States and in England, where English is widely spoken and used. It is considered a foreign language in countries where English is not widely used in the community. So for example, here, French would be a foreign language because there are not widespread communities using this language. There's also a difference noted between naturalistic and instructed acquisition, which is right inside their name, so they're easy to remember. So naturalistic is really how language is learned, in their communities, with families, and in social situations, whereas instructed acquisition is more formally, typically in the classroom. And then the last distinctions we're going to make here are between linguistic competence and communicative competence. So linguistic competence having more to do with knowledge of grammar, and communicative competence including this grammar, but also an understanding of how to use language in actual communication. All right. This chapter also outlines lots of case studies, which might seem disjointed, or they might seem of little importance, but these are case studies that are actually still referred to today. They formed a strong basis for research in second language acquisition. It's important to know about them if you're going to continue your education in bilingual ed or in linguistics. These names will come up over and over again, and these studies also, some of their implications are really what's most important. So let's take a look at some of them. Wong Fillmore's study of 5 Mexican children. So the purpose here, so she had 5 to 7-year-olds, and she did her research over 9 months with them at an English-speaking school in California. And each of the students was paired with a native English speaker. So they were native Chinese speakers, native Spanish speakers, paired with a native English speaker. And she watched them play together. She watched their spontaneous speech. She took note of their communication with their partners. And what she noticed was they really moved from wholes to parts without worrying about the little things, making sure that they were being understood and understanding primarily, and then we're worrying more about things like pronouns and grammar. So that's what I'm talking about here when I say they worked on big things instead of details, and they moved from wholes to parts. So the implication really of this research is that the students did not need to go through specific grammar points in a certain order in order to have communicative competence and to learn and develop as communicators in English. Schumann's study of Alberto. So Alberto was a 33-year-old from Costa Rica who was living in the United States, and his study lasted over 10 months. During this time, Schumann saw very little growth in Alberto's English development. So he sort of attributed this to Alberto's lack of acculturalization into American society, that he really wasn't interested in being more like the Americans. He was put into this category of a bad learner. He was locked into his own specific linguistic community with little opportunity to communicate with native speakers, have native models, and in that way, his English became pigeonized. Schmidt's study of Wes. So Wes was actually also 33 years old. Wes was a Japanese learner who also showed very little linguistic development during the time of the study. However, Wes did show growth in terms of communicative competence. So he was learning language naturalistically through his contact with native speakers. He had regular contact with them. And so he learned to communicate, and his ability to communicate improved during the study. He still did not show much development in terms of grammar and the details of language, and Schmidt sort of attributed this more to Wes's personality, that he wasn't the kind of person who cared about details or paid attention to them, and that he was more concerned about bigger things, meaning over form. Ellis then describes his own study of 3 classroom learners in London, ages 10 to 13, and the research question was, is the pattern of development the same for naturalistic learners as it was for classroom learners? And really what he found was that the patterns were really similar. Language acquisition follows similar patterns no matter if it's done in a classroom or out in your social world. Lardier's study of Patty. So Patty was of Chinese origin, but born in Indonesia. She lived, I believe, in China and Hong Kong. She arrived in the US at the age of 22. And there are 3 different recordings of Patty. One took place in 1986, which was about 10 years after she had arrived in the US. And then the other 2 recordings took place in 1995, almost 10 years after that first recording. So they were able to compare her over time. So although Patty had been living in the US for about 20 years by the second recordings, and she'd had these favorable learning conditions, opportunities to work and be with native speakers, education, formal education in English as well. She still made many errors in her speech, even in the last recordings. So the researcher attributed this to the age factor, that Patty really did not begin learning until adolescence, and that she was not immersed fully until she was in her 20s. So he attributed this to her age. So these case studies, not one is any more important than the other, but if we look at them as a whole, there's some value that came out of these different case studies. They used data that was based largely on spontaneous speech, and that's what has been identified as the most useful data to obtain when studying language acquisition. So instead of trying to get kids or people to specifically respond using speech, instead to just listen in and observe, spontaneous speech provides the best data. The studies also kind of agree that learners follow this similar pattern of language development naturalistically and formally. There's also variations in the rate of development of individuals, and this can be based on a huge multitude of factors. So they said, we can't just even put two people of the same age in similar conditions and get the same results. There's variations of the learner themselves, there's variations in the communities and external factors, and we'll look a lot into variations in this course. And these studies also set the groundwork for some of the universal and variable aspects of language development, which we'll also get into, some universal understandings and some variable understandings. And then I made a little note here to watch the twin baby videos. So those are posted in the Module 1 content folder. There's just 2 videos of part 1 and part 2. They're really similar. They're these twin babies who are producing spontaneous speech. And we just want to kind of think about what value would there be in somebody interested in second language acquisition, listening to and observing this spontaneous production of speech. So age is a factor that will be talked about a lot in second language acquisition, and you'll note we already saw it once in the study about Patty. And although there are some kinds of general conclusions, there's also areas that are still pretty fuzzy. So we'll just go through this. So adults proceed generally through the earlier stages of syntactic and morphological development faster than children. And that can be because they have better study skills and they have learned to be learners. They have metacognition about their own language. They can help transfer that to a new language learned. Older children acquire faster than younger children for some of the same reasons. And then acquirers who begin natural exposure during childhood achieve higher proficiency than those beginning as adults. And so that is really the basis behind the push for early language development for bilingual programs in elementary schools, not just starting language development in middle and high school, because even though the younger children may learn slower at first, they tend to eventually achieve higher than students who did not start until a later age. So this all comes from the 1979 study that you can see cited above. There's been lots of research on age. Some agree with each other. The Olson and Samuel study said that adults outperform children in the short term, which we saw just on the previous slide, and that there are some proposed reasons for this. Cochrane said that in naturalistic situations, children outperformed adults, and in formal learning situations, adults outperformed children for some of the same reasons: focus, study skills, metacognition. Then considering age and then ultimate achievement. Okay, so we're not just looking, if we look at 2 people over the course of 1 year of their development who's achieving faster, because that was typically found to be adults or older adolescents. But if we're considering their ultimate achievement, Harley found that early immersion programs showed greater results. And that also was argued because people were saying, well, the reason they have greater results is because they've had more time over time, right? If they start at 4 and they hit 50, they've had more time than somebody who didn't start until 15. Omaya said that naturalistic learners who start as children have a more native-like accent than those who started as adolescents or adults. This one's generally agreed upon as well in current research, though there are exceptions to this. And Fledge said attainment of pronunciation declines as learners' age increases, which goes along with Omaya's study about accent and pronunciation. So that the earlier you start, the more likely you are to have a native-like pronunciation. The critical period hypothesis also goes along with the topic of age. The hypothesis says that there's a fixed span of years during which language learning can take place easily, is really what it says. And that after that time, it's much more difficult. So there was a lot of talk about this at one point. It's called CPH. Penfield and Roberts said language acquisition takes place during the first 10 years, and then after that it becomes much more difficult and you can't attain as high. Scoville said that advanced non-native speakers achieved at the same rate as child native speakers on speech and written samples. So there starts to be some confusion into is this really true? Birdsong said that there was similarity in performance between non-native. He said that this similarity is actually not possible between non-native and native speakers. So really what came out of all of this research is a conclusion that there's really no good evidence that CPH is true, and there's no clear time period that's ever been identified or upheld as being the prime time to learn a language. So although we might say, or we might think as current researchers, that native-like proficiency is more possible when individuals start young, there's no specific age range that's ever been agreed upon, and I don't think there ever will be. We're going to talk about some things that can happen. These are just some noticings of researchers that have become kind of widespread terms that are used in second language acquisition discussions. So fossilization has the word fossil in it, so it's easy to remember. When something becomes fossilized or hardened over. So this quote I'll read says, a permanent cessation in learning before the learner has attained target language norms at all levels of linguistic structures and in all discourse domains, in spite of the learner's positive ability, sorry, I think I spelled that wrong, opportunity and motivation to learn and acculturate into target society. So there can be different reasons for fossilization, but really the definition is saying there's a learner that's developing and growing in all areas, and then due to some factor that may not even be identifiable, the person just stops their development and they stay at that same level. So I bet you can maybe even think of some examples. Maybe you have a grandparent that spoke Spanish as their native language, and they can communicate in English, but they've reached a certain level of English. Their accent doesn't change now or sound more native-like. They continue to use mismatched pronouns or the wrong endings on verbs. And so that's kind of what would be an example of fossilization. Some research on fossilization, just that there's variation in when learners fossilize, also in why. But learners may reach target language norms in some aspects, but not others. So maybe in their vocabulary or in their verb use, they reach target language norms, but not in their accent, their inflections, things like that. And then Hannah actually identified 49 different variables that can lead to fossilization, such as lack of attention, inappropriate learning strategies, etc. There's a video on fossilization that I'd like you to take a look at also in the content folder when you get a chance. So you can either pause this and watch it now, or you can watch it at the end. Stabilization is another term used in SLA. So this describes a state of L2 development where fluctuation has temporarily ceased. So this is different from fossilization in that it's not permanently ceased. So they kind of are going up and up. They reach a flat plateau, and then all of a sudden a breakthrough in learning occurs and they move up and up again. So even just thinking of my own personal second language journey and learning Spanish, I was growing in school as I was learning Spanish, growing and growing, and then I've kind of maxed out in college with what I was able to produce and understand. And then I moved abroad, and then I had this huge learning breakthrough. And so in my language journey, it's really obvious what caused that breakthrough. It is not always that way in cases that have been studied. So the end of the chapter kind of wraps up with this framework for exploring SLA with all of these different areas. And they refer to instructed SLA, so instructed as in a classroom setting, involves both the study of how the kinds of interaction found in classrooms influence L2 acquisition and whether learners actually learn what they are taught. And so we'll be looking at 7 different areas that are included in this framework. There is a chart on page 34 of the textbook, the Ellis textbook, if you want to see the areas all together and use as a reference. And they'll be dealt with in different chapters. We actually won't get to every chapter in this text, which actually might be a relief to you because it's a huge textbook. So area 1 talks about characteristics of the language learner. Those are things that we need to consider when we talk about second language acquisition, because they can determine the language learner's interest, motivation, ability, and those are really important characteristics for us to understand and be able to contend with as teachers. Area 2 is learner external factors that account for how L2 is acquired. So the first one was internal, the second is external. Area 3 is the psycholinguistic process involved in L2 acquisition. Area 4 addresses individual learner differences and what can cause these differences. Area 5 examines the part of the brain that's involved in storing and accessing L2 knowledge. Area 6 examines classroom instructed learning, and Area 7 examines which types of form-focused instruction work best. So all of these areas of inquiry kind of help form, I'm going to go back, they help form this framework to be able to explore SLA. Those are just kind of the 7 areas of study that help combine to form a framework that we can use to study more, because as it says, we're still exploring SLA. There might be tons of research on it, but there aren't tons of hard, fast rules. So we continue to explore in all of the following areas, and we'll be focused on some more than others during the course. So if you get a chance now to go watch the 2 videos, really there's 3 because there's 2 about the talking babies. So if you get a chance to go watch those videos in the module 1 folder and start thinking a little bit more about your definitions of these words and how you can use this information moving forward. And I'll be talking to you guys soon.